accordance with the, thank you. In accordance with the requirements of the open meeting law, please be advised that this meeting is being recorded and will be available, will be able to be found on the Lunenburg Access YouTube channel after the meeting. If you'd wish to view this remotely, as always, you can log in through Zoom. From a computer, you can use the link in the agenda. From the telephone, there's a toll-free number with the meeting ID number also in the agenda. If you've not registered for Zoom, you'll be asked for your name and email. No participant ID is required. Just press pound when asked. The agenda lists all the topics that will be discussed at the meeting and those that are reasonably anticipated by the chair. Votes may be taken as a result of these discussions. Not all items listed may in fact be discussed, and other items not listed may be brought up for discussion to the extent permitted by the open meeting law. So that was the call to order, and we have public comment, and I see that there is at least one person I did not anticipate being on here. So Anna, do you have a comment?
I don't.
All right. No public comment. Let's get to the new business, which is why I asked Peter Beardmore to be here. We're discussing the capital planning. I talked to Peter a little bit, and we had discussion at the school committee 2 or 3 sessions ago. But I understand that the capital planning committee and the master plan people, everything's sort of up in the air. But I thought it might be worthwhile for us to figure out what people are at least thinking about asking for as we go through the process of trying to find places where we can save money or spend money more effectively. So with that said, Peter, do you have anything you'd like us to know in terms of what we're building, what we're tearing down, what we're going to build a replacement for, and then leave in place for 35 years, only to let our children be saddled with the cost of tearing it down later?
So let me start by asking a question to clarify. Are you talking about capital as we approach capital planning, what has been traditionally a year-to-year capital plan? Are you thinking of this in terms of the type of capital that is stipulated in the charter, and but also stipulated that we put together a 5-year plan, which we aim to do this year in capital planning? Or are you thinking of this in terms of larger scale construction projects that are likely financed by excludable debt that would sit outside of the normal operating budget?
I think that it would be helpful to have us think about all of those things, but mainly the first one if we could. I mean,
Okay.
I know that you're pretty tapped into the town, so you could probably answer all of those questions, but I think it's trying to get a hold of like what the budget's gonna look like next year.
Yep.
And then, down the road, like that would be great, but I don't think we're gonna have that luxury. I think the budget's gonna be sufficiently tight enough that this is gonna be something we have to think about every year.
Yeah. So there's bad news and there's bad news. So the bad the bad news is that I can't give you any kind of indication in terms of what this year looks like for capital requests. What we currently have is what was submitted last year. In the out years of what last year, the out year would have been 25, 26, 27, and 28. For all of the departments, I have not done my homework, not anticipating that question. I haven't totaled the total value of those projects, but I could probably come up with that number pretty quickly. And we have not received capital requests yet in capital planning from all of the committees. That work is underway. We're anticipating our first presentations will be next week from department heads, and we'll proceed over the course of the next 3 to 4 weeks into likely into early November. And so at that point, we'll know the totality of the asks, and we'll follow suit with what we have done in previous years by providing the interim town manager with a prioritized list of current year or FY26 capital requests. But then we will also put together some semblance of analysis and report for the out years as well, hopefully by town meeting. Just for your benefit, you may not be aware, I hope you all are. The charter requires that the town manager submit a fiscal forecast at the beginning of the calendar year. Last year, a fiscal forecast was not presented, and to my knowledge, either in written form or verbally. However, in preceding years, it was done quite regularly, and part of what Mrs. Lemieux would present in her fiscal forecast was the delta between the anticipated funding level for capital and what was actually requested. And, you know, without, again, going to the numbers themselves, I recall that, you know, very regularly, the delta was, you know, 1 to 2x that which was actually funded for capital. So between what we funded and what was requested in a given year, it's typically less than half in terms of what we have been able to fund. And then when the town manager projected available funds for capital in the out years and the capital requests that were on the 5-year plans from the various department heads, that would typically follow suit. And so you would find yourself over a 5-year period, a delta in the tens of millions of dollars between what we anticipated we could fund for capital and what was actually requested by the department heads. So, you know, I don't anticipate that situation, if we were to continue with past practice, would be all that different. In fact, I have reason to believe, based on, you know, what we may be anticipating for free cash and other funding sources for capital for FY26, I expect that, you know, we are not going to have a substantial increase in available capital next year.
This is just like a question for me to understand, because I've only been in town for almost 4 years. When we submit our list of priorities, like when we go from school committee and we send them over to you at capital planning, we understand at the school committee that like not everything is going to be funded, which is why we put them in, you know, we rank them. Are other departments doing the same thing? Does everyone understand that like this is a wish list and not a grocery list?
Yes.
Okay.
The short answer to that question is yes. One of the things we've attempted to do this year is to come at this in a little bit more standardized format, which is one of the reasons why we weren't able to do it quite as quickly as we had hoped to this year. And Mr. Terenzini has been, you know, extremely helpful in working with us to align the department heads to be able to do that. And I also appreciate Dr. Burnham's participation in that. But I think at a high level, expectations were aligned, again, based on previous practice, that we just can't fund everything. Now, there is some nuance there. So, for example, we can't not fund our police cars, right? Like when the wheels start falling off of those things, that's going to be a problem. So, you know, generally speaking, the way the members of the capital planning committee have approached things like police cruisers is because they relate to public safety. They generally get a higher rating and are higher in the priority list. And to his credit, or to their credit, our current chief and even our previous chief You know, were very sincere in terms of what the needs of the department were, and many years, you know, did not request that which we anticipated they would, because the existing cruisers were doing better than we anticipated, either with lower mileage or they were wearing less or whatever the case might be. But we generally prioritize vehicles dealing with public safety. And so those are regularly funded almost every year. Whereas things that I might consider to be public safety related, but are, you know, perhaps considered more, um, have a higher degree of optionality to them. Things like, you know, the glass covering that we were looking at for all of the schools, you know, that has been, you know, has fallen down on the list relative to the other direct delivery of safety related services. But there have been a number of years recently where, you know, we have only been able to fund those things that fall into that, hey, these are safety related issues. I would say, you know, looking at it over a course of maybe 10 years. Now, within the last 3 or 4 years, we've been able to do things that are a little bit more discretionary. And I'm really pleased about that. But that certainly wasn't the case for FY25, and I don't anticipate that will be the case for out years in the near term either, unless we do something different.
This seems like a crazy thing to me, that you would receive a list of expenses or proposed expenses, but not know how much money you have to spend. Why did the town manager not present a fiscal forecast? Do we know that?
I don't have an answer to that. I called attention to it multiple times publicly, but I can't answer that. I can tell you that there are structural problems with our approach that I think need to be addressed in the charter.
What are they?
Well, for example, the charter calls for the capital planning committee to bring forth a capital plan. And the capital planning committee has historically brought forth a prioritization list. But in actuality, a plan requires a funding plan as well as the needs that are presented, right? But that is the exclusive domain of the town manager. It has been exclusively managed by the town manager in recent past practice. And when challenged, you know, in the way of looking for legal opinions from town council in terms of, you know, how complete that level of discretion on the part of the town manager is, it's pretty big. It's almost entirely the discretion of the town manager, to the point that town meeting can't even change the items on the capital plan list. All it can change is the total amount of funding. But the town manager brings forth that article with the funding number. So the capital planning committee is largely hamstrung here, right? We are not part of the long-term planning process, really, as we are currently structured, and as our recent past practice has illustrated. Now, I and members of the capital planning committee do aim to change that somewhat, at least to bring forth something of a picture, an illustration in terms of what the needs are in the out years and how those could potentially be prioritized. But in terms of a financial plan to support that, that is actually outside of the remit of the capital planning committee.
So let me make sure I understand what you're saying. The prioritization list is only half of what you guys want to have. You also want to have attached to each request some mechanism for funding it. And that is not required by town charter. And the funding mechanisms are largely determined by the town manager.
They're determined by the town manager and by fiscal policy from the select board. So there are fiscal policies that the select board has as part of the financial policy that is currently in review that stipulate certain amounts of money to go to capital planning. A very large source in the past has been free cash. But there are other, sources out there, but a lot of that is stipulated by fiscal policy that is in the remit of the select board.
So how did you guys know what to do if you both did not have a fiscal forecast nor a plan for raising money when you set priorities? You just assumed that we had the money?
Yes. I mean, Mr. Schoenbrini, I will stipulate what I'm explaining is ridiculous, but it is what it is.
Is that normal?
Actually, it is in smaller communities such as this. For one thing, you have to remember, we don't know state aid 3 years. We know state aid on or about January 15. And in the 4th year, we don't know state aid until basically February 1. That's the year in which the new governor takes office. Unless you are either devoting a certain amount of your budget and you're able to do that fiscally, or you're using sinking funds. That is, you have a schedule of all your equipment. A cruiser is going to last X years, you know what it's going to be, and every year you set that money aside. Funding capital plan is extremely challenging.
So let me call out a couple of things that are good here. Right. So number one is, to her credit, the previous town manager set up a special purpose stabilization fund for large vehicle purchases. Now, over the ensuing years, the definition of what fell into the large vehicle purpose category changed. But the initial intent of that special purpose stabilization fund was fire trucks and ambulances. Somewhere along the line, it expanded to big trucks for the DPW as well. I'm not sure why. It was never acknowledged by any financial policy or town meeting, but that's the direction we went over the course of the last couple of years as we argued about ARPA funds for big trucks. But nevertheless, we have a fund that is specifically targeting fire trucks and ambulances and large vehicle purchases that we put money into every year. And then that money becomes one of the funding sources for the capital plan, right? So when we go and buy our next ladder truck or whatever, that'll be a high priority item, I would expect. And the funding for that will come out of that special purpose stabilization fund. So for certain things, we have done that level of planning. I would call those like high impact sort of requirements. But we have not done it for example, when we get the DPW requests, we frequently get requests for both equipment, but also projects, right? Typically having to do with stormwater runoff problems, which exist all over Lunenburg, or bridges or culverts or those kinds of things. And imagine the predicament that we find ourselves in when we then have to prioritize a culvert on XYZ Street and playground equipment at the primary school. But that is literally the predicament that the capital planning committee is put into. Personally, I would like to see a real plan that dedicates a certain amount of money every year to infrastructure, and whatnot. But right now, that's just not how we do it.
When you set your priorities, like one of the things that I wanted to do, and Evan talked me out of it because it turned out to be a crazy plan, was to try to break things down, not into the normal way that towns view it as like discretionary and non-discretionary costs, but things that we have legal obligations to pay for. So like if we're under a contract or if the statute says we have to do it, how often do you guys take into consideration when doing your prioritization, those kinds of things? And then the second question is, how often do you take into your prioritization things that pose liability risks for the town? So like, if you had like like an intersection that we knew was faulty in its design, and they asked to redesign the intersection. Like, how do you guys do that?
So by charter and policy and bylaw, we do not have any guidance in terms of how to go about doing that. There are some best practices. In fact, when the department heads submit their requests, they fill out is it called ClearGov, I believe, is the application that we use. They fill out a scoring mechanism that is derived from the Collins school at UMass that did a project many years ago in terms of what are all the criteria that you would look at when analyzing capital requests. And so things like, is this mandated, is not directly, but indirectly included in one of those scoring mechanisms. But that Collins scoring system is only a guideline, right? And I think most of the capital planning committee members will tell you that it is good to kind of check your work against the Collins system, but it would be very difficult to compare on a year-to-year basis any of our priority lists as individuals with the math that is derived from the Collins program. So I guess that's a very long answer to tell you that there are attributes that can be calculated, but in terms of what we are charged with doing as members of the capital planning committee, it's more about how we personally reflect upon the information that's presented by the department heads, which is why we've tried to standardize it more this year, because there has been a great degree of variability in terms of how things are presented. And then, what the other information that we have to go with, such as Collins scoring, and also, who we're representing on that panel, right? The capital planning committee is made up of a select board member who is a elected office holder, a school committee member, which is the seat that I hold, a finance committee member, a planning board member, and a citizen at large. We bring our various constituents to mind when we're evaluating this as well.
It's a mistake that the planning board the capital planning has made in the last 5 years.
I'm sorry, can you
what is a mistake? Like when you guys did your funding prioritization, can you think back on one that you're like, ooh, we screwed that one up? And if so, what were the factors that led it to get messed up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to jump on one in particular because I hadn't thought of that in advance and I haven't really thought it through. I can tell you that some areas that I've been disappointed with over the course of the last couple of years, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they were mistakes, is we have been unable to not only solve, but even begin to deal with the parking problem at the Eagle House, which I think is we failed as a town to deal with that so far. I think, the window issues in the schools with respect to, the safety film, I personally think that, I disagree with my colleagues on the capital planning committee in terms of where they've prioritized these things. I think we missed last year with respect to the entrance and playground equipment at the primary school. That's up again this year and has been prioritized higher by the school committee, and hopefully it'll get adequate consideration this year. I can also tell you that strategically, there have been some really big arguments in capital planning over the course of the last couple of years. So let me give you an example. Last year, the DPW director brought forth a plan to add a loader to our inventory. A loader is used for various purposes, but the biggest one is to put salt in the back of trucks during a snowstorm. And our loader is probably at 80% of its lifespan right now, and at some point is going to need to be replaced. But with that plan was not to retire the old loader, but to have the old loader serve as a backup. And two members of the committee thought that that was not a well-reasoned plan, because if you have a backup that's at 80% of its lifespan, you're going to need to replace the backup within a year or two. And this is a $250,000 piece of equipment. And so relative to the other items on the capital plan, we thought, are we biting off on a $250,000 commitment here or a $500,000 commitment? Because now we're buying a new loader and a backup. And there wasn't a sufficient strategy articulated by either the DPW director or the town manager or the select board at the time that said this needs to be a priority. And we were very divided on that particular item in capital planning. So when we look at things that are net new, those tend to be a little bit more controversial. I joke with the police chief every time I talk to him and ask him what the odometer reading is on the F-150 truck. Because I still to this day can't understand why we have that in inventory, but there it is. We own it. So I think that there are things that we could potentially do that perhaps in the way of getting the select board and the school committee together and saying, these are our priorities, rather than, and having perhaps the select board endorse some of these requests, I think would perhaps go a long way in helping the capital planning committee figure some of these things out. Because, frankly, I don't feel entitled to be pushing back on the DPW director from where I sit. But given the current structure, if I don't understand it or I don't agree with it, I feel like I have an obligation to push back. And so I think, there are some areas that we need some help.
This is a crazy question. So I'm not anticipating a non-crazy answer, but oftentimes in certain places in the law, when we're really worried about people's personal biases creeping in, they turn to these things called actuarial risk assessment instruments. So for example, the classic one is bail and sentencing. A lot of states have these scoring tests that are non-binding, but just suggestive to the judge about how to evaluate the risk of a person asking for bail. And in the same idea, using empirical data, they've created, it's supposed to be, it's not, but it's supposed to be empirically data-driven sentencing, and they have the sentencing guidelines, so the federal court. Do you think it would be helpful if instead of having what sounds like the Avengers from town government plus some random citizen sitting there and deciding how we spend millions of dollars, if we had some sort of empirically guided, legally rigorous scoring system, not just oh, we check with this, but this is how it's going to be done unless we vote unanimously to override the rank order?
Yeah, I think that that is, I wasn't part of the project that led to the Collins program, but I think that that is sort of the closest thing to what you've just described. And I can tell you that it's inadequate for our purposes, because when push comes to shove and you get into the actual requests and the situations at hand, at least that math does not seem to be serving us well. So I think you may need an Avenger level solution to what you just described. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying I would be very skeptical that we could get there anytime soon. And it's back to that problem of trying to figure out a culvert on Northfield Road that's 120 years old, that's, by the way, working fine today. I drove down Northfield Road yesterday. But at some point that thing's going to be a problem, right? Versus playground equipment at the primary school that, is probably not built for the ages of the kids that are using it. And how do you balance those two, right? I have a background in risk management. I previously represented a product that is in governance, risk, and compliance, and a lot of these products are backed by extraordinary risk science that is helpful in these circumstances, but I have not seen how to apply it yet to what we're doing in municipal government.
Carter, do you think that would work? Creating some kind of, empirical rubric to prioritize spending within the town? I mean, if we don't have a fiscal plan or a fiscal forecast and we have no plan to fund these things, it sounds like we're just seeing who yells the loudest when we allocate money. And that does not seem like a prudent thing.
Well, rolling stock is relatively easy to understand and prioritize.
Yep.
Cruisers, that, you need to keep new cruisers because once they go out of warranty, your maintenance costs are going to go up in the teens in that particular year if you get out of warranty. Fire trucks, all the others. The challenge is on the non-rolling stock items, if you will. Even on the buildings, you can put some assessment upon those, though that's a little bit harder. How much should we be setting aside each year? So the challenge becomes looking at, the basic issues of, is it a legal issue? A building code issue, let's say, or in the case of the playgrounds, is it a safety issue? And then also operationally, will this item reduce operational costs or at least help keep them down, whether it's new IT equipment or the like? But I don't know of any community that's been able to risk assess the non-rolling stock issues in the manner you spoke to, Tony. I'm not saying they're out there. I'm just saying I'm not familiar with them.
One thing that I'm trying to figure out is like, why are we assuming that certain things need to be replaced? Like, what's the crime rate in the town of Lunenburg? Has it gone up or has it gone down? Has it gone up compared to the towns surrounding us? And has it gone down in any relationship to the number of cruisers we have? What is the, like all of those kind of questions seem like they're off the table, and I'm not sure.
Well, no, they're not. Tony.
Okay.
In fact, that information is presented annually in budget requests to the Finance Committee and synopsized to the Capital Planning Committee when those capital planning requests come forward. And there's considerable assessment and comparison to surrounding communities and best practices and norms when it comes to police and fire and DPW and alike. There were some Council on Aging. I don't know that I've seen a direct comparison in the past, but for the big money type requests in our biggest departments, including schools, as you well know, there are measurements that we as a community have to budget against.
Tony, if I might, the other is a philosophical issue, which is there are communities that essentially work to failure. That is, when the piece of equipment dies, they finally throw the towel in and decide they need to replace it, as opposed to replacing on schedule. Two challenges to the sort of work to failure approach, if you will. The first is that lead times have really become excessive. A cruiser that you used to be able to get in 3 or 4 months today is 8 to 10 months, and some of the elongated purchase schedules on the other. The second piece is that when a piece of our equipment goes down, the loader, You can't, there's nothing you can do in the dead of winter, except A, go without, start loading it with a smaller, much smaller backhoe, or rent equipment. So I've been, to the degree possible, always a fan of the replace to schedule, not try to stretch things out approach. That again becomes how much money is in the pot in that particular year. That is why some communities, though they have to go through the capital planning process, actually replace certain types of equipment, cruisers in particular, within the operating budget. They say, you know, we need a new cruiser or two cruisers every single year. We're not going to rely upon free cash. We're not going to rely upon the capital budget. We're going to put it right in the operating budget to make sure we have this particular item every single year. Plus to that is you have the equipment every year. Minus Dr. Burnham and the town manager have to have a conversation every year of how little money is available for the operating side of the community.
Evan has a question.
First off, my apologies. I completely spaced the meeting starting at 6. I thought it started at 6:30, so I apologize. That's always been sort of a concern of, or a problem with me, is that I see capital purchases as unexpected, unanticipated, or at least minimally anticipated purchases. Not, we know we're buying this every year in and year out, because that's not a capital purchase at that point. That is a planned purchase, just the same way that buying pencils are a planned purchase. You know you're going to have to buy it every year. So pulling it from the capital is defeating the purpose of the capital projects in themselves, and draws your line much higher up on the list than you would for other things that are in there. I mean, we have a stabilization fund for ambulance and fire trucks for that exact reason. It's just the idea that we see year in and year out, oh, it's time to have another cruiser on the capital planning list. It doesn't make sense to me. That should be a line item in a budget, not borne by free cash. At least that's how I felt about it. So I guess it's not a question. It's more of a, I don't like it.
It doesn't make sense to me that if we're oh, sorry, go ahead, Ezekiel, go ahead.
No, still being newer to the town, I just had a question. Has there been a cost benefit analysis done of leasing equipment versus purchasing?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Ezekiel. So sometimes, and that is something that the Capital Planning Committee has asked that we begin doing this year, particularly for net new asks, right? So for example, one of the things that we've struggled with in previous years is, you know, cost of ownership versus cost of service. You know, the classic example is the investment that we made in the tractor that has caused a little bit of controversy this year that is out, you know, trimming the sides of roads. That was a $170,000 item. We've got a person on that item, and we insure that item and maintain that item. And in previous years, we paid a contractor to do that work for us. And so, you know, there was a cost benefit analysis done at the time on that. In my opinion, it was not convincing, but we bought the tractor anyway. You know, here we are. But for net new equipment, the Capital Planning Committee believes that we absolutely need that, and you know, need to understand the calculus of it. And the calculus is different from department to department or project to project. But you know, should have the opportunity to really dig into some of these things, because you know, sometimes when you, not only is it the expense of the equipment, but it's also the expense, you know, the cost of ownership of that equipment is frequently not trivial.
So let me ask Carter this. If we did what Evan said, since we are let me make sure I get the terms right, replace the schedule community, what if we made it such that the budgets for each department included the things that were routine large purchases? Because it sounds like what capital planning is designed for is non-routine, very large purchases. It makes no sense to me that we're breaking those things up when we are, as you said, a place to schedule community. Just put them in the budget, and that way they're at least, like one of the things that Evan's talk last week convinced me of was we may not be able to save money or increase revenue, but if we have some degree of predictability in town costs, that's better than what we have right now, which just seems really haphazard. So why wouldn't you put those in the town budget? Or why wouldn't you put those in each of the departments' budgets?
So let's talk about the department's budget and the special stabilization fund that you have for large equipment. It's really pretty straightforward. You take the schedule of every department that has what I'm going to call rolling stock or fixed capital replacements. How you pay for them is separate from whether or not it's a capital item. All those items should go through capital planning. They can be paid for with cash, debt, leases, free cash, operating cash, but those really are separate. So let's take your large six wheels, which are now probably around $250,000. You can hopefully get 15 years out of them. You simply divide that out, and you either set it aside in the stabilization fund, as Evan has spoken of that fund, and you have as well, Peter has as well, or you put it into the operating budget. So here's really simplistic approach. Let's say that you have $1 million for your police department, just for numbers, and every year you need 2 cruisers. That's $100,000. If you pay for them with a capital exclusion or with debt or with free cash, you still have $1 million available for the operating budget of the police department. But if you pay for them out of the operating budget, you still only have $1 million under Prop 2.5 for the police department. And so you're saying to the police department, you have $900,000 for operations and $100,000 to replace cruisers. And that's why a lot of communities, particularly those operating up against the tax cap, don't put these things into their operating budget because they have to starve the operating budget in order to fit them in.
We're paying for them anyway. Like, what difference does it make? I mean, that seems like
Not all money is created equal, however. Free cash, debt exclusions, capital exclusions.
So one potential
monies,
approach that I've heard, Dave Passios shared with me, and I haven't validated this, but I believe he told me that the town of Ashby has a program whereby they completely fund their capital plan every year, not all requests, but whatever number they come to, they fund through a debt exclusion every year. And they go out and they pay for what they need, but they don't actually, do a full bonding process. They actually pay it in 1 year and then move on to the next year. So your capital is basically a surcharge on top of your levy limit on a year-to-year basis. The problem that brings is that it has to go to ballot every year and get approved. And if it doesn't get approved, then you're kind of stuck until the next year. But there are different ways to skin the cat. I'm not sure that would work in Lunenburg, but I've been skeptical of some other things that have come to pass. So who knows?
Well, if I might, let's say that you have your budget, your stabilization fund for ambulances and fire trucks. The prior process in many communities was to take those fire trucks one at a time. Fire trucks always being the favorite things for town managers because A, they're expensive. You like to spread the costs out. And B, they're most likely to get approved by the citizenry. But you can have an override which is devoted to that stabilization fund. And should you ever try to change it, the override is dissolved automatically. So let's say that you wanted to have Grafton has an extra $1 million a year that goes towards roads, period, end of story. It can only go towards roads. They also just passed a $1 million a year capital override. So you can tie the override to these stabilization funds, and the override does go away if you try to stray from the purpose that you told the citizens you were going to use it for. That's very different than a general override, which can change after the first year. So there are a number of mechanisms depending upon the tastes and the climate in the community.
So could we do a targeted locked-in override like you just described to increase salaries across the board for municipal employees?
Well, that kind of override doesn't get locked in. It has to be used in conjunction with a stabilization fund.
Carter, in the example you gave, does that say it's $1 million override targeted to the stabilization fund? Does that have to be spent that fiscal year, or does it
It has
just
to
ride?
it has to at least be raised on the tax rate. That was some bad news I got to deliver to Grafton. That was a lot of fun. Because if you don't raise it in the very first year, and they had scheduled to raise 0, they got it passed. They scheduled to raise it 0. Well, when you take 0 in year 1 and you increase it by 2.5% in year 2, it's still 0. So no, you don't have to expend it all in the year in which it's raised, but you do have to raise it in the very first
On a
year.
given basis.
It then becomes the decision of the select board in each year thereafter whether or not to raise it by the 2.5%. You could leave it at $1 million for 5 years and then start raising it. You know, you can do whatever you want, but that does become a select board decision. So they actually have 2. They have a special purpose override and stabilization fund for I can't remember if it's just roads or if it's roads, culverts, bridges, you know, infrastructure in general. And then they have one for capital, and I'd have to look back as to how they define that.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So you raise $1 million, you collect it in one fiscal year, it goes into special purpose stabilization fund. And it can sit there for as long as you need, but it can only spend towards what I would say it was for fire trucks or cruisers or something.
Sure. Let's say you raise $1 million for the purposes of your public safety rolling stock, and it's limited to by the wording you put on it at town meeting. It's limited to fire trucks, ambulance, police cruisers, you know, whatever you limit it to. And that particular year, what you need is 2 cruisers and 1 ladder truck. Well, that's $1.4 million most likely. So maybe you wait till the second year or you figure out how to do it, but you don't have to spend all of it every year as you collect it. You can aggregate it until you get to where you need to be.
But do you have to collect? You don't have to collect it every year.
Yes, you have to. Well, yes, you do. You have to impose it every year.
But it's not, you decide whether or not to depose it every year. So
You
every year
decide
it comes to a
No,
decision
you
again.
decide whether or not to raise it by 2.5% every year. So the $1 million in year 1 becomes $1 million in years 2 forever until such time as you add the 2.5% to it.
Carter, what if the town of Lunenburg were to create these targeted locked-in overrides for the rolling stock and for infrastructure and remove those from the budget of the respective departments entirely and use the money that's left over after you remove them to increase the salaries of municipal employees?
I don't
Would that
believe
work?
you have any financing for rolling stock on that basis in the budget currently, do you, Peter or Evan?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Tony was saying, what if we remove from the operating budget those annual amounts that are needed? But I don't believe you have any of those in your operating budget right now. You don't have cruisers in there. You don't have contributions to stabilization funds.
No, well, we have
We
been,
do.
we have been regularly funding the special purpose stabilization account to the tune of $250,000 a year
Out of,
out of $50 million that flows
no,
to
no, no, I mean, I guess I meant, what is the funding source for that?
raise and appropriate.
Okay. So that would actually, Tony, be going backwards from the progress you've made.
So one other thing I wanted to ask Peter, and this is a follow-up on Ezekiel's question about cost benefit. So I think this is anecdotal, and I have no data to back this up, but I think that an expenditure on the part of the police department, like having Brad in schools or having a social worker on staff, is, as Carter put it a while ago, you're spending a nickel to save a dime. When you guys get capital expenditure requests, do you ever ask the departments, is there a better way for you to accomplish this same goal without asking for this money? Because like if it's, we need to replace a cruiser, I'd rather, based on what I've seen, hire another Brad, or, you know, like I feel like if you have somebody that can prevent these flare-ups, you know, domestic flare-ups or whatever, that requires a cruiser, by being more in the community. I mean, this is the very notion of community policing, that you are not responding to problems, you're heading them off before they become problems. Do you ever require them to like go through that kind of analysis before they ask for the money? Like, you know, if it was the school board, you would say to them, like, have you guys considered, you know, like changing the way you bus the students, or changing the way the buses arrive, or, you know, instead of, you know, rebuilding that parking lot? Like, do you
Yeah,
make
so-
them think through other ways of doing things?
So keep in mind, the capital planning committee has an additional duty of 4 members
Oh,
of
that's
other
true.
boards, right? So, and we concentrate most of our work until, you know, basically the second quarter of the fiscal year. We're looking to elongate that this year, but that is not something that we have done in past practice. I would say the best answer I can give you, Tony, is that that's really the cost benefit analysis work that we're asking for, particularly for new expenditures. But, you know, I know a little bit less about police work than I know about paving roads. You know what I mean? Which is, I know nothing about either one. So I have to rely on the expertise of the person who's coming forward, who says this is something that, you know, is a net cost saver or not, right? Like, let me just give you one example, and this kind of, you know, ties in the risk theme of a little bit earlier. We had gotten the request for that training equipment for the police department last year that ultimately just landed in the form of an earmark for the police department. And it was just below the line this year. It was kind of right in the middle of our priorities list. But, you know, the pitch that the police chief brought to us was that, you know, this is the kind of training that relates to circumstances that police officers find themselves in every day. But oftentimes de-escalation training is done, you know, in a day of training, maybe once a quarter or once a year or something like that. And when you have the ability to deliver it in 15-minute or 30-minute increments on an everyday basis using a computer-based training system, then it's going to be substantially more effective than the more traditional approach to training. And, you know, in my mind, that seemed like a win, right? And, you know, because number one, I want our police officers to be the best of the best when it comes to de-escalation. And number two, I want their training to be, you know, extremely efficient in the way we deliver it, because every minute that's spent training is a minute that we're paying for, you know, for the trainer and the trainee and the overtime and all of that stuff. So, you know, in my mind, that made great sense. And I'm really pleased that we were able to be, you know, secure an earmark to pay for that.
You know, like the one thing that I noticed over the 3.5 years that we've lived in Lunenburg is that Chief Gamble has consistently asked for money to be spent in really smart ways. Like when he asked for a social worker on staff, I mean, I know very large municipalities that have no social workers on staff. You know, Nashua, just to the north, they just got their first social worker. They're a substantially larger city than we are. And, you know, I see him allocating money for things like, you know, Hank's replacement, knowing that Hank is really like, I know this is like a joke in town, but I think that we are not adequately counting how valuable Hank and Brad are in terms of the impact on people's safety, right? Like the letter that, I don't know if everybody saw, there was a letter that Chief Gamble had gotten about how one of the students who was sort of socially isolated and having a difficult time in school really bonded with Brad. And I think that like he's done a really good job of that. And I think keeping that in mind as a model, what if Peter, instead of having like a risk assessment model, you guys had a procedure where you had to, you know, had them go through these procedural hurdles in order to ask? I mean, I don't want to make it more onerous on the departments, but at the same time, if you prompted them to do some thinking before they asked for money, maybe you would get better lists. Like the loader thing seems like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, why are we paying, if we have the need for one loader, why are we trying to figure out a way to pay for 2 loaders? You either need 1 loader or you need 2 loaders, but you don't need 1.5 loaders. Like that does not make any sense to me. And I don't mean to throw shade at anybody at DPW, but the logic that you went through to explain to us why you rejected that seems perfectly valid. It makes no sense.
Well, I can tell you, there are plenty of people that disagree with my position on that. So, you know, but you know, that's what you have to do when you're doing this kind of job, is to throw the best reasoning that you can at these situations, right? And we are, you know, as I outlined earlier, we are asking for more from the department heads in terms of standardizing and justifying their requests such that we can make, you know, better, more informed decisions. But ultimately, you know, they're not really decisions at the end of the day either. It's a priorities list that is ultimately a tool for the town manager and the town meeting voters.
If the recommendation that the budget task force made on this front was, you know, to endorse a plan for, you know, more cost benefit analysis before requesting, but also to mandate that the town manager present a fiscal forecast every year, would that help? Or is this just like a drop in the bucket? I don't know how this works, because like at my firm, we don't have any expenses before we know how much money we have. And you're telling me that that's not how the town runs, and it just seems baffling. But maybe that's because I'm really naive about how municipal financing works.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage you to, you know, take a look at the charter and the requirement for the fiscal forecast. You know, I think some of these items are what you make of them. And you know, in the past, our fiscal forecast has, you know, with respect to capital, been what I described, which is an explanation of the delta, not how to solve the delta. And, you know, I think that that is a leadership challenge more than a structural or regulatory challenge, right? It's, do we have the intent on the part of our select board to say, we want a plan, come up, you know, here's a problem, go solve it. And that did not happen under the leadership of the previous town manager or the current select board. If it happens in the future, I would absolutely recommend that, as well as some structural changes, to help support that in terms of how we go about doing this, because the calendar and the process and the roles and responsibilities are, I think, should get a second look, or a third, or a
Or is
fourth.
it normal for the town manager to not present a fiscal forecast?
In many communities, it's not done at all.
In the communities where it's part of the charter for the town, is it often ignored?
Generally not in my experience.
Okay.
I will say that part of it is.
That only happened this year. There is a report for previous years, right?
Yeah, I get it.
I will say that in my limited time with you, I have noticed one item that is both a cost item and reduces running time in preparing the budget. And I think, I can't remember who it was, questioned why we try to have things done so far in advance. And it's that requirement that you have mailed out to everybody in the community the actual warrant. That is I'd have to double check. My recollection was that I was told that, between the two mailings, it's around $7,500 a year for printing and mailing, and that could probably be reduced by 5,000. But it also would give you more running time if you were to convert. Now, this is a charter requirement, so you're not going to do it quickly. If you were to convert to a simple postcard notice, with, now that we have the web, have had it for a while, that the warrant's available with the web address and printed copies at, let's say the central offices for the school, the library, and so on and so forth. That would give you an extra 2 weeks to evolve your budget.
Charter that went
And
right
save money.
directly on the punch list.
And save money, while still informing the community where the document's available.
And could we add to that for folks who can't get out to get a hard copy and aren't able or computer savvy enough to look at it online, that they could call and have a copy mailed to them,
Yeah, we could
like on
probably,
request?
yeah, we could probably do something like that. We did that in one community where we changed the process and people were able to call and get on a special list.
Okay. Because I imagine we have people like that in town for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that list would be much more than 100 people at most.
Yeah, yeah.
And over time, it frankly would probably diminish to zero.
Mhm.
That's a grim thought, Carter.
No, people become
it's-
more, computer
it's-
savvy,
it's-
more comfortable.
it's-
Oh, excellent. That's a great way to think about it.
It's simply aging, when my stepdaughter, who's now 41, is 65, she'll be a lot more keen on the use of the internet than I
Yeah.
am.
Peter, is there anything else you think we should look at in terms of changing how things are done? Is there any chance that we could do something like Southwest Airlines, where they locked in prices for all of that airline fuel like 20 years in advance, and everybody thought they were crazy, and then it turned out to be their saving grace?
Well, I can tell you that one of the areas that we have not talked about tonight that I think we probably are going to find ourselves in conversations about are capital planning items that the authorized or the appropriated funds are not sufficient for the projects that are now needed relative to inflation and other circumstances. One of the challenges that we have when it comes to capital planning is putting a finger on the price tag. Frequently, to get an accurate price, you have to spend money to go get that price. And, large building projects are a good example, right? But when it comes to buying a vehicle or putting in a patio or something along those lines, our recent experience is that the projects cost more than we thought they would. That we, we landed on the number that was derived from quotes from contractors that, then a year or 18 months or 2 years later, when the funds were finally available, the price had gone up. And I think that that is something that we may find ourselves having to deal with more this year and next year. And, you know, the current process is that that will need to, you know, first be absorbed by the department budget itself. But I'm not sure of our capacities to do that. And I say that in all honesty, I just don't know. But that is a topic that I think we're going to find ourselves talking about this year. And also just the amount of work that we need to do as committee members. You all have taken on an extraordinary additional amount of work. 4 of the 5 members of my committee also serve on the town manager screening committee. So now we are staring down the battle of 2 months of capital planning work and 2 months of screening committee work. And in all honesty, I don't know how we're going to do it. You know, because we all work too and have jobs and families. So, you know, it's not just the financial burdens. We are personally taking on some pretty extraordinary burdens as volunteers in the community. And, you know, I would love to work smarter, not harder, but I have not been successful recently at that.
So, Peter, thinking about the, you know, getting better estimates of the cost at the time the request is submitted, how much of that do you think is just not doing the homework and coming with a good estimate versus how long it takes to actually pull the trigger? And by that time, the cost has increased.
I think it's both.
It's a 50-50 split. Do you think the homework
Well, I
is
think our
being
recent
done up front?
experience is probably both. Yeah. Yeah.
So what takes so long to get to say, okay, I don't know, I want a new pickup truck, and I've got a quote from auto
Yeah, so
dealer
let me give you a
X.
practical example, right? Air conditioners at the primary school.
Yeah.
We spent $0 getting those estimates. We relied entirely on the goodwill of contractors who we then kicked the can at least 2 or 3 times on that in terms of the job itself, and then have to go through the acquisition process, which doesn't guarantee anybody the business, right? So by the time we needed to, you know, refine those numbers and work it through, I don't know, the 4th or 5th or 6th time, Dr. Burnham, you could be more accurate than me. We had pretty much, you know, expended the goodwill of these contractors who are willing to help us to zero in on a price. So then you got to go to the next guy and he says, oh, that other guy did it all wrong. He didn't have the right electrical plan or whatever, right? And you kind of wind up in this death spiral. And at least that's my recent experience, is it's really hard to put a pin in some of the more complex projects out there. A vehicle is, you know,
That
outside
should be
of
the simplest, right?
a vehicle, it should be pretty simple because it actually has a price tag. It's a piece of equipment, but the projects themselves, particularly when there's construction involved or engineering, is a little bit more complex.
Because I forget somebody, maybe I don't, I think several people actually have said it now at various meetings, that the town is really good at spending money on studies. That's not a compliment.
Well, that, I understand that. I understand that and tend to agree with it. Unfortunately, you need to spend money to get good information in order to make good decisions.
But there's a time component, right?
I agree.
Like that information is only good for a limited amount of time. You got to, you know, when you get the information, you got to be ready to pull the trigger. You know, the quote is only, I want to get trees cut. That quote's only good for, you know, X number of days. If I wait a year and I go back to them, oh, that quote's not good anymore. It's more now.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, what can we do to to be more
Right.
efficient.
I had this conversation with my dad while he was making us pizza on Friday night, as he does every Friday night. And he mentioned this exact problem, that the town is spending a lot on studies. They're basically spending money to get estimates that are invalid by the time we have the money to do the work.
Yeah.
And he had indicated that this was a problem in the military for a long time, and he worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And what they did in response was they created these project plans that were really, really, really detailed. Like, he was giving me an example, and I can't remember the exact details, but it basically set forth like everything about the building, down to the number of people that would likely be working there, the number of men's and women's bathrooms. I mean, it had everything. And it was super precise. And they found that by making the plan so precise, they had less variance from contractor to contractor in terms of estimates. And so it wasn't that big of a difference. Like, if we get a quote, his idea was, if you got a quote from one person, but you had this really complete building plan, the next person wouldn't be able to give you a quote that's like 25% higher, because all of the requirements would be the same. And I think that, like, looking at stuff from the school committee's perspective, like the turf field project, there's a bunch of stuff that we don't know about the turf field, but the turf field is like a really discrete thing. We know what we want it to do. We know what it has to do. And so, like, unless they find something under that field that's like a big giant surprise, the chance that we're going to have like multiple different estimates is low. But then you have the problem that Peter mentioned with the air conditioning, which is, even if you have a really precise plan, if it takes 3 years for something to get budgeted, then you can't. So it's both, I think, a question of how do we make our proposals more complete, and how do we act on them faster? And I think that like the more detailed plan solves the first problem, but I don't know what the problem is with the second thing. Like, I have never witnessed an organization with as many unnecessary buildings as the town of Lunenburg. I mean, like, on a per person basis, there's like, 3 buildings per 100 people that we don't need. And we don't get rid of them, and that costs money.
With
So-
all due respect, I don't think we can solve all the problems tonight.
No, but that's the
I
problem.
would point out to you that your solution to spending a lot of money on studies and plans is to spend more money on studies and plans, if you're going to do it in a more detailed fashion, right? I mean, so you need to think about that critically.
Yeah.
And there is a process to building buildings, and you got to follow that process. And the other problem that we have is we have churn, right? Like, raise your hand if you've been part of a building committee or led a building effort in Lunenburg. There's nobody on this call that's done that, right? So, or put in a turf field, or, done most of these things that are large projects. So you uncover things that that were left to you by people who did these jobs, 10 or 15 years ago, because none of us were doing these jobs then.
Carter.
So a couple of observations. One is, a lot of communities get caught up in what I call analysis paralysis. They don't have a real clear sense of exactly where they want to head. And so they look at this plan, then they look at that plan, then they look at this plan. And their heads explode over the prices of all of them, because they're so big. But, ask any of your friends who's done a kitchen lately, what a kitchen or a bathroom costs, just to give you a sense of people's inability, with all due respect, to comprehend the costs at these scale. The second thing is, I don't think in the municipal sector at this smaller level, we necessarily do a great job at price estimating, because we rely upon calling a contractor that we think will come over and give us a price. That exhausts goodwill, and it's not the best way to do it. So whether or not you put, let's say in one community, an RFP out there for a town engineer, and as part of that, there has to be a civil engineer, a professional engineer, soils, landscape, and you get better estimates at the beginning, and a better defined project at the beginning, that might be helpful. The second piece is because a lot of people are often in price shock. They don't add what we call design development. Maybe today you know what you want, but in a year, the regulations change, the equipment changes. Wait till you see what's about to hit your diesel truck fleet in January of this year if the governor doesn't extend it out. And finally, we don't add contingency a lot of times. So if you take a project that's well estimated, and remember, estimates are trailing viewpoints of what things have been costing. Where do they get their takeoffs? So when you're looking at a project today, an engineer is going to give you a price based upon the last 18 months, which has been ramping. So the odds are that as it starts to flatten out, they're in pretty decent shape. But when it goes the other way, they're totally off the mark. So I think if you had a better sense of the projects, you set aside what I call design development, it's not going to be for a year. A project that's being presented to Peter's committee tomorrow probably had data collected over the last month, isn't going to town meeting until May, and won't get built for a year, and then having sufficient contingency. Now, that is the plus of going about that method. The minus is you have to set aside more money, and there's always pressure to drive projects down when you take them to town meeting. So I leave you those as observations of many communities across the Commonwealth, not necessarily a critique of Lunenburg.
Is there anything else we want to talk about in terms of capital plan now that we are all depressed?
Evan's
Evan
can I-
has his hand up.
Can I make it more
Oh, yeah,
depressing?
yeah, yeah. Sorry, I didn't say
Okay.
it.
So to add a little more kerosene to the fire, I mean, how old are some of these project reports that we're looking at? They're a decade, 2 decades old. We haven't known what we wanted to be when we grow up as a town for decades. And now we're not the town we were decades ago. And we're trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up again. So the consensus is going to be a nightmare to figure out what the town actually wants is going to be next to impossible. And I think we're going to continue down the same path that we've been on, which is we get a municipal building design committee up and running, and they do a ton of work for a couple of years, they report out, and then the town comes back and says, oh, we don't want that. This was 2 years ago. We didn't want to do that anymore. And at that time, we have, RFPs out, and we shut down all the money, and we just have Vertex reports that are out there now just to say, let's keep this building barely functioning. And that's all we have. So I think it's a little bit of a cart before the horse issue in this instance, because we don't know what we want as a town. The town doesn't seem to have any idea what to do with buildings until they fall over.
Well, I think I think directionally, we know that we need to provide better space for both our employees and our constituents at a high level. We have some serious deficits. Those deficits are in our town office buildings. They're at Turkey Hill. And I think that directionally, we know we need to solve those problems. And I think that there are some, directional indicators in terms of how to do that we should collectively get behind. And I think that the high level theme here needs to be investing in Lunenburg, right? We need to invest in our infrastructure, and we need to invest in our people, because we are measurably falling behind. And that can be seen in our attrition rates and vacancies and you name it, right? That's where my head is at. And I think, more and more, I think people are understanding that.
But at the same time, we've had these issues with buildings for decades. TCP has not been falling apart just for the past year. It's been falling apart for, I don't know, forever, basically. It's at a high level, yes, we have an idea. We want to have a functioning town government in buildings that are supportive of the employees and look nice, and we have open spaces for people, but that's the high level. We don't have any sort of ideas. Do we do Ritter first? Do we do Town Hall first? Do we just knock the Brooks House down? Do we sell the Brooks House? We don't sort of have that. What's the next step to get started, get that ball rolling?
Yeah.
We know sort of, yeah. I suppose we do know where we want to be, which is this sort of almost myopic view of the town in a sense, but how to start that process, I don't think the town has any clue.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit more hopeful, Evan, but I can also tell you that at the same time, the position of the school committee has been, and I think Carol Archambault has probably said this best, and I will not paraphrase it well, but she said, the ball needs to keep rolling. And if it doesn't keep rolling, and the school committee, I think, has been a really good partner with the town and trying to allow for the municipal building committee to do its work and figure out what that path is. But we've been kicking the can on Turkey Hill for quite a while now. And the history there is very long and involved in terms of how we got elementary school students into that building and why they're there. But the reality is that we've got what is now a 55-year-old building that was built for middle school students that is servicing elementary school students. And we have a project that has just gone out for proposal to help us figure that out. And I think that the school committee is resolved, without speaking for the school committee, that we got to move that ball.
Is there anything else anybody wants to interrogate Peter about more tonight?
Thank you for having me.
Peter, it was really helpful. I knew you would be able to answer questions.
Well, they're my opinions mostly, but hopefully they helped. So
I trust your experience as somebody who did risk management, but I trust your experience as a townie more.
I always have a good story to tell.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So we had action items for next week. Nothing for master plan. I don't think they have anything for us. My understanding is that they were off cycle from us. Is that right, Ezekiel?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So we'll just hold them out there and keep going. Next meeting, I think next meeting is the one where we start to turn the corner and start coming up with ideas. Which, I don't know. Like, ideas win the lottery. Let's make sure.
I guess what's the plan for that? Because how are we going to come to a consensus on ideas, or is this sort of what's the plan for reporting out ideas?
So I don't know. I mean, like, I'd be open to a bunch of different ways of doing this, but like one of the things that I think, like, I've just been keeping like a punch list of ideas, and like one of the things that I think is pretty much a no-brainer is the consolidation and improvement of investment rates. So like, I don't know how we write that up, but I don't think anybody here is saying that Evan's idea of investing more wisely is a bad one. Right? Like, so I think that what we need to do is we need to figure out like what we're trying to do, what the wording of the actual suggestion would be, and who it goes to, right? Like, we need to do that. Is that what you envisioned, Renee, when you were like, we should do recommendations to the, I mean, I forget what you had as the charge for the budget.
Yeah,
draft.
I haven't pulled it up, but for that investment one in particular, that was submitted as an article for the warrant, right, Carter?
Perfect.
As he submitted?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
I can't remember what number, but that's on the warrant.
The
Okay.
prudent investment strategy, yeah.
Prudent investor mode,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Along those lines, going way back now, does anyone know that drop in the budget. What year was that? I forget. Uh,
Talking about the 2019 drop for the
was it that late? 2019? I thought it was before that.
missing funds, the one
Yeah,
funds
there
we
was like
didn't-
the bar graph and then it just, there was a cliff. And I don't know if it's because those were assigned to different lines in the budget or that money really
So this is the
disappeared.
I have this track down the revenue from miscellaneous non-renewing revenue. That was
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
I I have no idea where that comes from.
What year would, do you have a year?
I thought it was, let me see, I take notes. Hold on.
I would have to look up it's on my other computer. I'd have to look up the actual plot.
I thought it was 2019, but let me check.
Miscellaneous non-recurring revenue.
Yeah.
Was that the year you got the smart growth fund of, I think, around 350,000?
I don't know. I thought the drop was around 800,000. Do I remember right? You guys are gonna make me pull up the graph, huh?
I believe that's right, Renee. It's like 800, 900,000.
It was our revenue meeting. Which was probably
Be the August, sometime in August.
August, yeah, the August 5th meeting, I think.
Yeah.
It's the same one we found the nope, it's not in that file. I think it's when we found a non-recurring or the prudent investment. We weren't making as much money as other people. Maybe it was the 19th. No, that's expenditures. Oh, I'll have to dig it up. I want to keep you guys while I look.
So the way I grouped them, and this is just out of convenience sake, and I did it to parallel the way they came in. So like if it doesn't work, it's fine. Expense reduction proposals, and I think, like I think we should challenge people on the town side and the school district side to think of ways we could do that. I did, like I said, I have like a punch list of things that we could sort of talk that we've talked about. Then the next meeting was revenue increase proposals. That one's the one that's gonna have people mad at us, just FYI. And then the last meeting before a special town meeting, we're just gonna work on language and then, the presentation, and then that's it. Then we have town meetings. We really only have
Oh,
2 meetings before we have to like get everything concretized for our presentation at town meeting.
It fell off in 2015. I found the slide if you
2015,
want.
yeah,
Okay.
I just found it.
All right. Sorry, didn't mean to freak you out.
No. And it did. It's about what? The pen, 2015 to
over a million.
2016, 800,000
Yeah, just over a million
Yeah.
to just over 200,000.
in 1 year. But that miscellaneous non-recurring, I mean, that's as nondescript, meaningless line as I could probably think of.
It sounds like a made up line, a made up term from like Orwell's 1984.
I mean, non-recurring implies, okay, you shouldn't count on it every year, but 2010 through 2015, it was up there, and then 2016 dropped.
And nothing made up for it.
And ever since then, it's been pretty flat.
May I ask how long of a presentation you're looking to make at the fall town meeting? 5 minutes? Perfect.
I don't want anybody to get bored. I want it to be fast.
No,
I don't
no,
know
that's
who's gonna do
good.
it.
I'm gonna cut the 10-minute suggestion in my summary to 5 minutes.
3 minutes.
Name that
Um,
tune.
I wanted
Um,
to say the miscellaneous non-recurring could have
Yeah.
been some sort of grant that expired and we just didn't get the following year and it just leveled off.
Well, shoot, we should try
When
to
did you
get it
build the
again.
middle school?
Could be MSCBA or something. I don't know. I have to look back.
Could it have been the school building authority?
That would have ended in 2015?
I don't know when
Yeah,
you did that project. But you were, and it wouldn't have been 5 years. I mean, it might have been over 2 or even 3 years with the final audit. But it wouldn't have been 5.
well, I only went back to 2010. I don't know if
Does anyone know
DLS
when
has
the middle
before
school
that.
was built?
The ELS goes back to 2003 for revenue and
Okay, so then,
expenditures.
it wasn't.
You're saying Evan, was that high all the way back from to 2003?
No, I was answering
Oh.
your question for how far back
Oh,
DLS
okay.
goes. I have it pulled. Just give me a minute. I'll pull up my
Okay.
spreadsheet and see what it looks like.
Yeah, I think I just limited the data I pulled to, a dozen years or so.
Do we want
Tony?
to decide who is talking at town meeting?
I thought you were
Not it.
not it.
Got it.
Ezekiel, how about it's you and me then?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
I mean, you guys, are you thinking just like a bullet? I mean, obviously it's not like it's an update, right? And it's kind of like a bullet
We're not
point
committing
of,
to anything. We're asking for people's feedback and ideas. We'll tell
Yeah.
them what we've talked about, and then I think like the basic structure is going to be like the town is in crisis, and here is why.
well, please don't say crisis.
The town is about to explode into a Mad Max style
Oh.
apocalypse.
Couldn't we just have challenging fiscal times?
Mad Max style apocalypse.
Well, do
It's
you want to do a
it's so
community
depressing.
survey?
Every day on the roads. No, I guess it's probably something we got to figure out over the next couple of meetings. I don't.
I think we should just, go through the punch list and,
Yeah,
give an overview of what we've talked about.
Yeah.
And and we're looking to prioritize actions for next fiscal year, but we would probably like community feedback because, we have these meetings, we have public comment and not really anybody showing up.
The one thing I makes me commit to stronger language is what Chief Gamble said. I mean, Chief Gamble put it very bluntly, and it caught my attention, right? He basically said the town is in crisis. We're risking losing our greatest resource, which is the people, and we need to do something to change it.
yeah. I also think we don't have enough people, and I think our buildings and our infrastructure is in trouble.
Yeah. So what if we did this for next meeting? I'll work on it's not gonna be a speech, but like I'll work on some bullet points and I'll pass them back to Ezekiel. And so we'll talk about expense reduction ideas and we'll go through that and then we'll refine it one more time so that I don't terrify people by telling them that we're about to enter a Mad Max style apocalypse.
Yeah, the biggest missing thing is sources of revenue other than tax.
Yeah, well, let me see. I mean, Dr. Burnham was looking at the cell tower revenue, improved generation from solar panels. Carter recommended changing how the warrants are posted, but those are all like small potatoes things. They're
Yeah,
not gonna,
I
like-
know.
Yeah,
But hey, doesn't mean it's anything.
I think we
Doesn't mean
should
it's
do
not
all
worth
of them.
doing.
Even if they only have symbolic value, it shows that we're trying to track down every penny. The other thing that was mentioned, and Evan's presentation really crystallized this for me, but it's been on the punch list forever, which was increased tax bill to levy limit. And I don't think we ever heard why we shouldn't do, like, if we could tax that amount, why are we leaving it on the table?
So I realized that the reason that 230,000 was left behind was because that was the abatement year. That was the whole tax
That's the
debacle.
outlier.
It
So there was
wasn't this
nothing,
past.
we've taxed to the limit every year.
I don't know about this year. I haven't seen the closeout yet, so I don't know if we did tax within the limit or within plus or minus a few thousand. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
All right.
Historically, we have, I mean, there was,
Right.
if you look
Well,
back,
for FY25, you haven't set the tax limit.
no.
No,
Yeah.
but for FY24's closeout, I haven't seen what we levied yet.
We're, yeah, we've got some adjusting entries we have to finish up yet, and the department that has those, I know, is working hard to try to get that behind us. So we're hopefully not much more than a week away from being able to close the books. I'll get a better idea of that when the finance team meets this week, and I can chat with Izzy tomorrow.
And do we want to talk about a split tax rate with the assessors, Board of Assessors? Or a distribution of our CIP in Lunenburg, what that looks like.
I've still not heard back from them from my last email, so I'm not sure if they're avoiding.
I don't know,
Or-
they're
or
meeting
what.
this week,
They're
right?
busy, I'm sure.
Izzy and I are meeting, and town council are meeting with them Wednesday night. Evan, so if you could forward that to me, I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Evan, did you happen to find the numbers?
So it's interesting. I did, but they don't line up with the titles that you had. For revenue sources, I see taxes, service charges, licenses and permits, federal revenue, state revenue, revenue from other governments, socialist or special assessments, fines and forfeitures, miscellaneous, which does not total over $1 million ever, and on this list, and then other funding sources, and that's it.
It's
And
under
transfers.
local revenue. It's a category of local revenue.
Local
look it
as
up.
in state revenue,
No,
because we do have a drop that takes place in state revenue. 2015, we pulled in 7.4 million in state revenue. Actually, no, we don't have a drop. It just continues to go up. And then next year it was almost 7.8 million and then 8.2 million.
no, look it up. These are categories under local revenue. I have to go back to the spreadsheet, but it has everything from motor vehicle excise, right, which is most of it. Meals, special assessment, building permits, all sources of local revenue.
hmm
And this is one of the sources of one of the categories.
What's interesting is that this should encompass the same thing, just with other categorizations of it. And I don't see anything that drops precipitously between 2015 and 2016 on
Right, the total
data.
local revenue doesn't change much, but that category does.
It does change. In 2015, the local revenue was over 3.5 million, and it was about 3.25 million in 2016.
Yeah, okay.
So it does drop.
Yeah, I guess the scale, the bars don't look as,
Right.
but I think all of that drop, or at least most of that drop, is due to that miscellaneous non-recurring drop,
hmm
that category. Would a school be in that category, Carter? An MSBA?
If you're getting reimbursements from them under the new method, yes, but you wouldn't have been getting them in that time period if you finished the middle school in 03.
When was the high school finished?
I believe the high school opened in
16?
2017.
17? Could that be it?
I poked around, I found a news article that said that they broke ground in 2015. So it's likely that they finished in 2017.
So for 16 and 17, yes, you could have gotten reimbursements from
Yeah.
the MSBA.
16 and 17 are down already, though.
Yeah,
that's not
that's,
it.
the timeline just doesn't match
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
I mean, in service charges, we did drop between 2016 and 2017. That was over a million. That was, no, not over a million. That was about, 100, it's only 150,000. Never mind. That's
I
small.
don't even see service charges.
That's what I'm saying. It's broken out in different ways, apparently, on the
Yeah.
website, on how you look at their data.
I think I have it in an Excel spreadsheet too.
Oh, I'm walking through pivot tables of that right now. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so I don't know if we can find that out. So Tony, when's our next meeting?
October 7th.
Oh, Monday.
Next
Okay.
Monday.
And Carter, we don't have to do anything for the warrant itself at this point, right? You have the article.
So
The-
my plan was to
language.
give you the draft warrant next Monday or Tuesday and have you act upon it on October 15.
Okay.
Assuming town council, I mean, I don't think town council is going to see any real issues in it. We do have one that's coming out of the listening sessions that I wrote about in my weekly
Okay.
report to y'all.
So what should we put on the agenda for next week? Expense reduction proposals, draft of talking points for special town meeting. That's all I have. Is there anything
Yeah, the
anybody else?
punch list.
Yeah, I got it.
Basically,
I'll send them
yeah,
around.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think to, yeah, discuss the
Yeah, I
punch
got that.
list. Yeah.
We could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, these are basic, these next two meetings are gonna basically be just smushed together of those two things. So if it's an increased as we all know, it's an increased revenue or decrease in spending, they're the same thing.
The one thing we haven't covered yet is any consolidation of services.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we did a little bit. It was on the punch list from the very beginning about reducing duplicative town work and school expenditures. But I don't know of any other, we could definitely put that on there. Let's put that on there as well.
But I mean, we haven't like in detail IT or grounds or I don't know what else could be.
I do have a question for Evan, or perhaps Ezekiel. Have all the indirect costs to support the sewer users been calculated to make sure that the general fund is recapturing all of those appropriately?
I want to say yes, but
Okay,
I have to verify.
That's sort of my intuition as well.
I think we've got a clear idea of items. I think we've covered old business. We're on to public comment. Anna, it's your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. A couple of things as you guys talk about other sources of revenue. Mr. Michael Ray Jeffries had spoken about quite a bit the placing solar panels at the old town dump, and he has requested, I think, a $25,000 ARPA request, and I guess that didn't make the cut. But perhaps our interim town manager can speak about the possibility of that revenue, because I know Grafton is one of the towns that have done that, where they have a partnership with a company that places the solar panels on a town property, and there's a share revenue model. When I heard about it, I did some research, and it's a pretty straightforward model, but it's one that not a lot of towns have explored, but Grafton seems to be one that has been successful. Basically, it's just you have a solar field, and it's a share revenue with a company that puts them, installs them and manages them. The other thing is, Mr. Scalabrini, I'll say this, Lunenburg is not we're not in a Mad Max world. And I hear where it may feel that way, but I think it's always a question of how and where we decide to spend the money. But the beginning of my thought is, I don't think government should ever have too much money where they're having an easy time just spending money. I think the work that you guys are doing is very important. I think it's talking about, prioritizing, how we prioritize, how we make it better. But I mean, I've been in town for 20 years. I like budgets. I like numbers. I could go on and on explaining how we're not in a dire need. We just haven't decided how to take care of our infrastructure. We haven't decided how to do it. And I think it's a little bit of like the people making the plans. Let's talk about buildings. People that are making these plans, and then the people that are voting at town meeting. Maybe there hasn't been a good, honest, I shouldn't say honest, a good work on actually delivering a product that town meeting will approve to have. So, I also see a little bit, I don't, it's not a question of the volunteers are doing this. Just have said town meeting tends to make the right choice. But I don't think we have gone to the common ground in town meeting. But definitely Lunenburg is not in a, Mad Max world type of place. And I'll leave it to that. But I appreciate the work you guys are doing. It's nice to go over some of these things that as you guys explore and learn about it, and it's interesting to think about it. So that's all. Thank you.
Just for the record, that was me being facetious. I do not think we're at a Mad Max stage. That being said, I do think that not last meeting, but the meeting before paints a pretty grim picture of how municipal employees are doing. And I think that, like, obviously there's room to improve. So I appreciate your comments. By the way, Anna, I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity if you wanted to say anything. The last meeting we had talked about the park proposal, and I had a reaction on video about my understanding of what the cost was. If you want to say anything, you're more than welcome. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I just I wanted to give you the ability to say something in response, because I felt bad afterwards. It was a eye-popping reaction to an eye-popping number, but I don't know what's going on. So if you want to say something, you're more than welcome. If you don't want to, that's also fine.
Well, I'm not the chair of the Parks Commission anymore. I am
Okay.
intimately familiar with the project, but I can tell you one thing for sure. When I was the chair of the Parks Commission, and before we ever applied for a grant, before we ever thought about, is this project feasible or not, we worked extensively with the previous town manager to ensure this was the right time and we had the ability to do it. So I have emails dating back a year and a half ago from the previous town manager where we set up a plan, a feasible plan for this project to exist. Now, if she didn't communicate with you, with other boards and commissions in town, or if they didn't ask that question, I don't think it was necessarily my job to go around town and at the time and say, hey, we have a plan, please ask us about it. I think a lot of times these commissions, they have their role, and you have to respect them, and especially respecting the town manager's role. It's important to be able to work with everyone. And, and this is the kind of project that you don't get it done alone. So, but I can tell you for sure, and there is document of that more than a year and a half ago, before the Parks Commission ever went out to ever apply for a single grant or even think that this was feasible, there were conversations with the town manager about, is this feasible within our current budget? And what I'll tell you in short is that we have had, under a regular debt, our debt, it's funded either to exclusion debt or under our regular budget. Since 2017 to today, our regular debt has dropped about $400,000 a year. And in the past year, it dropped another $100-something thousand. And the Marshall Park debt, according to the number that was projected a year and a half ago, would not put us over the amount that we were in 2017. We will still be under 1%. So, well, I just think that when we're in these commissions, we have to remember that, it's kind of fun to joke with our friends and our colleagues, but the intended audience is actually the general public. And, I didn't come here to say that. I made the comments before, but since you asked, when you make comments like that, it gives the impression to the world that, the Parks Commission have been working in this hole alone without ever asking opinions. That was not the case. I can guarantee you that, and I can prove that. So, I think the Parks Commission is going to come up with their proposals, and I just, for my part, when I was in the commission, we never did anything that could have a financial impact on the town without consulting with the town manager, which is in fact the CFO, the COO of our town.
Sounds good. All right. Anybody have anything else they want to add?
Yeah, I just Anna, you brought up the solar field. So it was mentioned a few times as part of the ARPA discussion, but we were never presented with any substance, a formal request.
Okay.
I know there were concerns about the cap of the dump. But yeah, it was just a verbal mention without any.
Sure. So what I know is there are companies that are on the state, have state contracts that we can hire them. I have the language of the contract. There was the most recent company town that did this was actually out of Bristol, Connecticut. It was a contract that was just issued last year, so I requested a copy of that. They also have a Freedom of Information Act. And basically you just need to have, you put a bid out that you have this space, and you're looking to you need to have some technical information about how big of a solar field you think you can have, but that's it's not fairly easy, but there is a lot of work on it, that you can get it done. And then companies come to you saying, I propose to do this as a shared revenue with this rate, and then you just pick one. Grafton has a very large field, which is a former farm, and they have different revenue sources, different proposals. But the main thing there is the revenue from solar. And Carter might be able to speak about it better than I can, because I didn't go too deep until we have the money.
Yeah, I think the question
Go
here
ahead.
was because of using the old dump, the cap on the dump, whether it would support a solar field. I think that was the first question.
So what I've learned is that is brownfield money available for towns to use it to revamp their dumps. So it'll be two processes, but there's no point on going down that path if we don't think we're going to explore the second path.
Yeah.
And there is another source of revenue from town dump, which is we've been using the town dump for yard waste.
Mm-hmm.
So now we can actually sell compost by the truckloads for yard waste. And that's something I had spoken with Heather, and she hadn't got around doing that. But, it was just one more contract, one RFQ that we needed to do, but that's another possibility we have of revenue.
None of this has actually been presented as like an action item or it's just like something somebody mentioned off the cuff.
Yeah, there was nothing concrete ever
Okay.
presented, a formal request.
Well, if anybody wants to present it, I mean, like, I don't think we have 2 meetings where we can do this, the next 2 meetings. So Anna, if you know anybody that has actual plans as opposed to, like an off the cuff remark made at select board, that'd be great.
Well, I think
you're getting very close to volunteering.
I know. I gotta finish one thing at a time. I wouldn't mind. Because I do think the town, it's amazing how much work gets done in this town by volunteers. I don't think I can undertake anything now, but it's the process to get some of these things done is not as difficult as some other processes that we have had. You know, and it's doable. I'm not sure. So when you say, you know, a proposal, like if you tell me exactly what you're looking for, I might be able to put a couple of slides together for you. Feel free to send me an email.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, the limited legal work I've done on environmental issues tells me that anytime you work with a former waste site, it is not just like, let's have an idea. Like there's like tons and tons of federal regulations, tons and tons of federal law. So like if somebody, if Michael Ray Jeffries has that stuff locked down, I that would be a great thing to see. I would love for him to come to select board or budget task force and say, here's all the things that we would need to know in order to get this process started. My guess is it's pretty complicated, and it's not just like, you know, what would the revenue be? Because, you know, like it's not everything to do with those places is always complicated. Waste sites are always difficult.
You know, what you're saying is true, and I'm sorry I stepped away. I
No, sorry.
pushed the wrong button. It is true, but it's not like I think what you described more is, you know, there's a process to do some of these things. It takes a lot of work. It's not something that we realize overnight. And what we need to have is a group committed to do, or a group or some leaders in town that are committed to bring some of these things to realization. And I think that's what you're talking about, because I actually seen where actually the very first gas station in Somerville was owned by a friend of mine who was a brownfield, and he actually was able to make millions of dollars selling that property in Union Square. So you know, it's just, it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of determination. But I'm not, I mean, if there's something this group would like to see as a formal presentation, feel free to email me and I'll take a look on the documentation that I have, and I'm happy to bring forward.
Okay, well, I'll email Michael Ray Jeffries and see if he wants to help you out, since it was his idea.
That would be great.
All right. Thank you,
Thank you.
Anna. All right, anybody have anything else we want to do?
I just wanted to mention, I ran a report out of Munis for the miscellaneous non-recurring revenue. I went back to 2015. So in 2015, you have the high school, middle school construction bond. Those are receipts posted to the miscellaneous non-recurring revenue. In 2015, there's 29.6 million bond proceeds, and then in 2016, it's 4 million in bond proceeds, and then it drops off. So that might be your cliff that you're looking at.
Could be the interest on those bond proceeds, is he?
No, it's the actual receipt when it's
Actual
received.
receipts?
Yeah. I'll send a report and I'll upload it to the drive after.
So that precedes the actual start of construction?
Well, you have to have the funding source in
Yeah,
order to start.
okay.
So that's right at the beginning.
Okay, yeah.
But I'll upload the reports. I have them here.
I would just give you guys this information since it was talked about earlier. The new middle high school was inaugurated on the fall of 2016, because my daughter was the last graduating class from the old high school, and she graduated in 2016. So the high school, middle school went online in 2016-17 school year.
Does that, I have one question, Izzy. How does that mean, or how does that work for the years prior where we also had very large non-recurring miscellaneous? Because we should have only realized that in 2015, I assume, right?
Correct. That's what I'm seeing. That's all that's in there. It's 2015 and then 4 million in 2016. That particular account only, but
Nothing in 2014?
Or 13, 12, 11, 10.
Or
when we
all the way
also
back
had-
to 10? I didn't look
Right.
before that.
no, I could only go back to 2011. There's nothing. But that's this one particular construction GL account. That doesn't take into account if there's another one created within the same category. But I can keep looking and upload those.
Is there anything else we need to talk about?
Nope.
All right, let's go. I will email Michael Ray Jeffries tonight.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank
Good
you
night.
again. Sorry for being late.